What is success? Al Bernstein said that success is often the result of taking a misstep in the right direction. Winston Churchill said that success is going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm. Bill Cosby said, I don't know the secret of success, but the secret of failure is trying to please everyone. Now, those are all interesting. But when you look at the Bible, the best definition of success, and it's at the top of your outline, just like it was last week. Success is finding and following God's will for your life. That's what success is. Finding and following God's will for your life. One of the most successful people, according to that definition, in all the Bible, was Joseph. We began a 6-week study of Joseph's life last week. To catch you up to speed, Joseph was the favorited son of Jacob. His brothers hated him. They knew he was the favorite. Jacob made no bones about it. In fact, Jacob even presented Joseph with this ornamented robe, the coat of many colors. It was a symbol that when Jacob died, Joseph would be the one who would get the biggest inheritance. That was unheard of. But Jacob did a lot of things that was unheard of. Well, Joseph began to have some dreams. He made the mistake of telling his brothers about those dreams. Joseph's brothers absolutely could not stand him. He was a tattletale. He was arrogant. He was 17 years old. He was his father's favorite. And in our passage today, Joseph is going to end up in the pit. Joseph is going to find himself at the bottom of a sinkhole. Something tells me every time Joseph's brothers saw him, they hated him even more. And more, and more, and more. We'll begin reading in Genesis 37. Picking up the story where we left off last week. In verse 18. They saw Joseph in the distance, and before he got close to them, they plotted how to kill him. The brothers said to each other, "Here comes the big dreamer. Come on now, let's kill him and throw him in one of the cisterns, and we'll say a wild animal devoured him. Then let's see what becomes of his dreams." When Reuben heard what they said, now Reuben was one of the older brothers. Reuben said, "Don't spill his blood. Throw him into this desert cistern, but don't lay a hand on him." He intended to save Joseph from them and take him back to his father. When Joseph reached his brothers, they stripped off that long robe that Joseph was wearing. That's his coat of many colors. Don't forget, I said it was very ornamented. It was a symbol. It was something that you would wear to a ceremony. Now he's out there in the desert. What's he doing wearing it? He was an arrogant little thing. Verse 24. They took him and threw him into the cistern, an empty cistern with no water in it. When they sat down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with camels carrying sweet resin, medical resin, and fragrant resin on their way to Egypt. Judah, now Judah was one of the older brothers too, said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and hide his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not harm him because he's our brother. He's family. He's family, so we won't kill him. We'll just sell him." It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? His brothers agreed. Verse 28. When some Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph out of the cistern. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they brought Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and found that Joseph wasn't in it, he tore his clothes. Then he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy's gone, and where can I go?" His brothers took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a great male goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the long robe, brought it to their father, and said, "We found this. See if it's your son's robe or not." Notice what they say. They don't say our brother. They say your son. See if this is your son's robe or not. Verse 33, he recognized it and said, "It's my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph must have been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on a simple mourning cloth around his waist, and mourned for his son for many days. All of his sons and daughters got up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, telling them, "I'll go to my grave mourning for my son." And Joseph's father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph to the Egyptians, to Potiphar. Potiphar's chief officer commanded the royal guard and was Pharaoh's servant. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, in this passage, we have 3 vital lessons that we can learn. 3 things that we can take away from Joseph's life, from this part of it at least. Here's the first one. The first thing we see is that we should be kind because hatred is like a dirty bomb. A lesson from the brothers. You know, I can't say what it's like to have a brother or a sister. My parents got it perfect the first time, and there was no need for any more. But those of you who have a brother or a sister, I know that sometimes brothers and sisters don't get along too well. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But if you had a very arrogant brother who was always the favorite, who everybody knew was the favorite, and just really, really smashed your face in it, something tells me that you would not be too happy about that. And I will never, ever think that every time Joseph's brothers ran across him, every time he came somewhere, they got, one eye was green with envy because he was the father's favorite and everybody knew it. And one eye was red with anger because they hated him for it. And there he pranced around every time they saw him in that coat of many colors, that ornamented gown. It'd be kind of like one of the choir taking their robe and just wearing it all week so everybody could know they can sing when you would love to sing and you can't sing. Kind of rubbing your face in it that you can't sing. Joseph was that type of a fella. And his brothers hated him because of it. What his brothers did was they allowed their hurt to become hate. And hatred is like a dirty bomb. We know what a dirty bomb is because of all the terrorist attacks. And I hear that one of the greatest fears some of the experts have is a dirty bomb. And what a dirty bomb is, they take a bomb and then fill it with some type of radioactive, some type of chemical warfare, maybe even like a smallpox virus. And they set the bomb off, and the initial blast happens, and of course that's always bad. But what's worse is the devastating effects after the blast. That's what hatred will do to you every time. Hatred will boil in you, and it will last, and it will last, and it will last. And you think, if I can just do this, I'll get over it, but you won't. You think as soon as I give them one more insult, I'll be okay and I'll be able to deal with it, but you won't. You think if I just remove myself from the equation and I never have to see that person again, I'll be okay, but you won't, because hatred is always there. You may not can see it, but you sure can feel it. And you sure can feel the impact it'll have on your life. Joseph's brothers, they stripped him, they threw him into the hole. I'm sure there was a fight, because Joseph does not seem like the type of a fella who would just say, okay, you want me to go in that hole? Fine. I'm sure he fought them with everything he could. But finally they overcame him, and they threw him in the hole. They sold him, and they thought they had gotten their revenge. They thought everything would be okay, but hatred doesn't go away like that. Didn't for them, it won't for you. It won't for you. That's why Paul wrote to the Ephesians, be tenderhearted, be kind, forgiving each other, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven us. That's the first lesson we see from the passage. Be kind, because hatred is like a dirty bomb. Here's the second lesson we see. It's a lesson from Jacob. Be honest, because those who deceive will be deceived. An amazing turnabout happens. Years and years and years earlier, Jacob had a brother, Esau. Jacob and his brother really were opposites. Something tells me they never got along. And there was a favorite child in that household too, because Jacob's mother always loved him better than Esau. So Jacob's mom came up with this scheme. Jacob's mom said, favorite son of mine, we're going to get that birthright. We're going to steal it because I want you to have it. Isaac was old. That was Jacob's father. And they tricked him. They deceived him into giving Jacob the birthright. Years later, Jacob hasn't learned to think. There's a favorite son in his house too. It's Joseph. His brothers hate him because of it, so they decide to kill him. Well, Reuben talks some sense into him. Reuben says, let's don't kill him. Let's just throw him in the cistern. Now, a cistern would be what they would have stored water in. It would have been probably 20 to 30 foot deep, and it would have been made out of solid rock, very hard rock, so that the water couldn't go anywhere. Now, these cisterns were empty. I can imagine what it felt like for Joseph to go to the bottom of that cistern. I have a feeling they didn't gently put him in it. So they throw him. He's got about a 20 to 30 foot drop. And when he finally hits the bottom, it's nothing but rock. And his brothers are looking over at him with glee. They take the coat that really was the source of their hatred. They kill a goat, put some blood on it, and take it back. And there's Jacob. they say, they can't even bring themselves to say, this is our brother's coat. But they say, Jacob, is this your son's coat? And Jacob realizes it was. And I read this passage and I say, how? How could children deceive their father like this? And we may ask the question, what did Jacob do to deserve this? I'll tell you what happened. Jacob was reaping what he sowed. If you go out behind your house tomorrow and you dig up a little piece of ground and you plant some green beans and you keep watering them and you keep fertilizing them, don't be shocked when you have a harvest of green beans. If you are sowing lies and deceit in your life, don't be shocked when it comes back to you. My granny used to always say it'll come home to you. You've heard the old saying, your chickens will come home to roost. Jacob's did. So be kind. Hatred is like a dirty bomb. Be honest. Those who deceive will be deceived. I've heard all my life that honesty is the best policy. But if you're a Christian, honesty isn't the best policy. Honesty is the only policy when it comes to a Christian. And the final lesson is a lesson from Joseph. And we learn be strong. Because God's children sometimes hit rock bottom. God wanted to use Joseph. Now, last week we looked at some speed bumps that Joseph had to overcome. And this week we find him in the sinkhole. We find him in the pit. Joseph had lived in luxury. He was the favorite son of his daddy. His road was smooth. And then in one moment, everything changed. His brothers surrounded him. They ripped off his coat. They tossed him into a hole. And if it was like he had been on the fast track to success, when suddenly he found himself in a pit. Literally. Literally in the pit. Thrown over by his brother. And the truth is, sometimes life is painful. The truth is, sometimes circumstances are troubling. And hitting rock bottom is not an uncommon thing for Christians to do. But the key to success is how you react when you find yourself at rock bottom. The great General George S. Patton said, success is how high you bounce when you hit rock bottom. Like Joseph, you may find yourself in the pit today. It may be a pit of a marriage. It may be a pit of a family. It may be a pit of a job. You may be struggling with worry. You may be struggling when it comes to your health or your finances. So let me share with you 3 things to remember when you are like Joseph and life has thrown you in the pit. First of all, remember, there is no panic in heaven, only plans. When Joseph's brothers threw him into the pit, there was not a scene in heaven where an angel looked over at God and said, do you see what just happened? What are we going to do now? And God said, well, I never expected that. That never happened in heaven. And let me tell you something else that never happens in your life. You never face a circumstance where God says, oops. You never go through something where God says, well, I didn't see that coming. There will never be a situation when God is panicking. And if God is the one who created the universe, and He is, and if God is the one who holds the universe together, and He is, And if God is the one who, even though He's that powerful God, loved you enough to die for you and knows you so intimately, more than anybody else in the world, and He's never panicked, why should we? Life may not always be pleasant, but God's never panicked. God never is wringing His hands. God is never worried. That's why Jesus said to us, don't worry about tomorrow. You don't have to worry about the future, because you can know the one who knows the future. You can know the one who holds the future in His hand, and the one who holds the future in His hand also holds you. When you're in the pit, remember, there's no panic in heaven, only plans. Only plans. Secondly, when you're in the pit, remember, coincidence is not in God's vocabulary. Keep that in mind. Now we know from later passages it was God's plan for Joseph's life that he end up in Egypt. Okay? We know that it was God's will for Joseph to end up in Egypt. Now I have a feeling Joseph would have rather gotten there some other way. But it wasn't a coincidence that he found himself there. It wasn't a coincidence that when Joseph was in the pit, a caravan of traders came by. It wasn't a coincidence that they were headed to Egypt. It wasn't a coincidence that at that very moment Judah came up with the idea of selling his brother instead of killing him. Joseph was not lucky. Joseph was blessed. Some people think that the only time good things ever happen to them, it's because of luck. But I don't believe in luck. I believe in the almighty plan of God. Something tells me months before this episode happened, God had placed in the mind of some Midian traders, we need to go down to Egypt. We need to take a little divine rendezvous, and we need to go to Egypt. And it wasn't a coincidence that at that very moment, Joseph's brothers wanted to sell him. This is the problem sometimes. I don't know how many of you like to do jigsaw puzzles. I don't. Never have liked jigsaw puzzles. I guess I just don't have the patience. But let's imagine for a moment that I had a jigsaw puzzle, and I poured it out, and I said, okay, now, I want y'all to sit together and put it together. And I took the box with me. Now on the box, on the very front of the box is what? The picture. It's what it looks like. It's what the end result is going to be. Now let's be honest, if I take the box with me, you're going to have a hard time of putting that puzzle together, aren't you? That's basically how our life is. Our circumstances are just one piece of the puzzle. And we may look at it and we may say, there's no way I'm ever going to get out of this. But you know what God sees? God sees the whole picture. And God is working in His plans and in His will to make your life turn into the picture He wants it to be. Now, I can tell you what God's will for your life is. So many people say, what is God's will for my life? I can tell you exactly what it is. God's will for your life is for you to become like Jesus Christ. And that's what the end of the picture is going to look like. And all throughout your lifetime, you're going to go through things one piece at a time. And what God is doing is He's creating the picture of you becoming like Jesus Christ. When you're in the pit, remember, God's not panicking. Don't you panic. When you're in the pit, remember, coincidence is not in God's vocabulary. And finally, when you're in the pit, remember, Sometimes your deliverance will show up like more trouble. Sometimes when your deliverance is coming, it will be disguised as more trouble. Let's rejoin Joseph in the pit. He's suffering in the rock bottom of a dark cistern when he feels a rope. A rope is hitting him on his shoulder, and he thinks, finally, my brothers were just playing some cruel joke on me. One of his brothers shouts, grab hold of the rope. We're pulling you out. Joseph must have thought, okay, they're going to apologize. They're going to tell me it was a big joke. I'm going to get my coat back. Everything's going to be okay. I'm going to get out of here. They've come to their senses. I'll be the big fella and I'll forgive them. Instead, when he got out, he learned he had been sold as a slave. His hands were bound, and he was tied to a lead rope. He was led off with the pack of animals, and the caravan walks to the sunset. The brothers finish their meal laughing at their brilliance, but Joseph isn't laughing. He's wondering, am I ever going to be free again? Am I going to die a slave? Joseph is thinking, I've just traded one trouble for another. You've heard the old saying, you got out of the fire, you got out of the frying pan into the fire. That's exactly what happened. Life is like that. When it rains, it pours. So don't be surprised if you feel like you've gotten out of one pit only to find yourself in another one. But remember, God's deliverance sometimes comes disguised as more trouble. Since we can look at the end of the story, we know in Genesis 50 how Joseph succeeds. And if he had never been sold into slavery, he never would have entered into Egypt. If he hadn't have been sold to an official of Pharaoh, he never would have ended up in Pharaoh's prison. If he hadn't have been in Pharaoh's prison, he never would have been summoned to the palace to interpret a dream, and you know the rest. And it was only after Joseph went through these circumstances that he realized God's hand was in it all along. That's why Joseph said in Genesis 45:5, listen to Genesis 45:5. Joseph says to his brothers, do not be distressed, do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Who did Joseph say sent him? God. 22 years later, Joseph tells his brothers God was involved in the whole process. The glorious truth about this passage is that God was always involved in Joseph's life. And God is always involved in your life. When Joseph was a cocky teenager full of pride, God was there. When he was sulking in the pit, God was there. Later, God would be with him when he was thrown into prison, and God was with him when he ruled as prime minister of Egypt. God was there. And if you know Jesus Christ, God will surround you and always be with you too. Somebody said when you get to the place where God is all you've got, you find he's all you need. Frederick Nolan is a Christian who lived in North Africa at a time of persecution. The Muslims had murdered hundreds of thousands of Christians, and he was being pursued by soldiers who was hunting him down to kill him too for his faith. He had been running, he had been hiding for days. One night he realized he was surrounded by soldiers. He saw a small cave in the side of a hill. He crawled into it. It was only a shallow depression. It was only about 6 foot deep. Wasn't a good hiding place at all. But he could hear the soldiers coming. And he knew this was the only chance he had of escaping. Well, as he huddled in the side of that cave, he watched as a spider came. And he watched that spider begin to weave a web over the opening to the cave. Within an hour, that spider had woven a beautiful lacework across the mouth of the cave. In just a few moments, he heard the footprints of soldiers coming closer and closer. They were about to search the cave, but the captain saw that spider web. He said, "Oh, there's no point going in there." He couldn't have got in that cave without destroying that spider web. And later he wrote in his journal, "Where God is, a spider's web is like a wall. And where God is not, a wall is but a spider's web." Do you feel like you're in a pit? God's with you. And God will show up in your life just when you need him the most. You may see one part of the puzzle today, and you may not understand why you're in the pit. But don't despair. Deliverance is coming.